Tenemos esta conferencia para la que hemos invitado al doctor John Lott desde los Estados Unidos y la señorita Nikki Gosser, que vienen a brindarnos su conocimiento para apoyarnos en las gestiones que tenemos con respecto a la legislación y control de armas a nivel nacional. Agradecemos la presencia de los miembros de la Policía Nacional que son tan difíciles de poder que estén con nosotros. Han hecho un esfuerzo grande. Muchísimas gracias. Apreciamos mucho que estén aquí compartiendo con nosotros. Sergio también, el señor asesor del congresista Williams, muchísimas gracias por estar aquí con nosotros. Y vamos a dar inicio. Estamos esperando una audiencia un poco más grande, pero ya vamos a dar inicio porque tenemos gente que se está conectando vía internet desde Ecuador, Paraguay, Argentina y también un poco de aquí de Perú. Desafortunadamente no hemos tenido varias cancelaciones debido a que amigos nuestros han dado positivo al COVID. Así que no han podido estar con nosotros, pero aquí nos están siguiendo a través de internet. Vamos a comenzar el pequeño programa que tenemos preparado para ustedes, dando la bienvenida al señor Igor Grimaldo. Igor es uno de los presidentes pasados de APPLAF. Ha sido básicamente un pilar de nuestra asociación. Junto con él trabajamos la ley de armas, la ley de armas de fuego, y también ha tenido un papel importantísimo en mantener y hacer crecer la asociación por varios años. Así que le doy la palabra a Igor para que nos dé la bienvenida. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Thomas.
Gracias.
Le agradezco a Thomas, la verdad, las palabras que creo que han sido en exceso, porque si hay un pilar en esta asociación se llama Thomas Saldías. ¿Okay? Eso es importantísimo reconocer. Les agradezco en primer lugar a los miembros de nuestra gloriosa Policía Nacional del Perú. ¿Ya? Muchísimas gracias por estar presentes. Yo creo que ustedes son un brazo fundamental, ¿ya? Que unidos a nosotros, a la sociedad civil, armada, legalmente, podemos pacificar este país. Quiero empezar agradeciendo y recordando un poco, ¿no? Nosotros empezamos a conformarnos, primero hace como 11 años, vía internet, por redes sociales, nos empezamos a unir. Entonces cada uno tenía diversos grupos, los grupos de cacería, los grupos, ¿no?, que nos gustaba hacer prácticas de tiro, de defensa, y había pues una pasión por un uso correcto y además legal de armas, ¿ok? Y Thomas nos empezó a impulsar para que nos asociemos. Y esa es la verdad. En diversos grupos nos conectó vía internet, vía redes sociales, vía Facebook o High Five, lo que había en esa época, me acuerdo. Entonces, y esto, ¿no?, lo que parecía como una broma, nos llevó a que finalmente el 12 de enero del año 2012, hace 10 años, nos asociemos un grupo muy representativo de peruanos legales, portadores de armas de fuego, de los diferentes grupos, o grupos de cacería, ¿no? Ahí está mi amigo Luchito Castillo, uno de los máximos representantes de la cacería en el Perú, grupos de tiro, de defensa personal, deportivo, ¿no es cierto? Ahí está mi amigo Jorge Lee, también socio de APPLAF. Y bueno, empezamos a juntarnos y a caminar juntos para una asociación legal y para apoyar al Estado peruano, a la ciudadanía, a tener un uso correcto, un orden y un derecho, ¿ya?, constitucional de las armas de fuego. Entonces, así nacimos y nació APPLAF. En reuniones interminables, lindas, ¿no?, en la casa club de APPLAF, de Jorge, Y bueno, sacamos adelante en conjunto con el Ministerio del Interior y otras instituciones públicas la famosa ley 30299, que con la bendición de Dios salió en mi gestión de Thomas, gestión de Luchito, gestión de Jorge Lee. Y dimos a luz a ese hijo, que fue un parto, además, ¿no? Porque, o sea, que juntara todas las instituciones del Estado fue todo un parto, ¿no? Pero finalmente salió adelante, ¿no? Y ordenamos, aun cuando en ese momento el gobierno de turno nos tenía exactamente al 87% de licencias no renovadas, en una informalidad tremenda, nos estaba dejando prácticamente fuera de la legalidad. Entonces, sin embargo, nos organizamos y de una forma correcta, legal, coordinada, ¿no? Y con muchos acuerdos tomados y consensos con las diversas instituciones del Estado, logramos sacar adelante y tener la ley de armas 30299, que hasta el día de hoy no se cumple. Disculpen el llamado de atención, porque hay un par de cosas que no las cumplen, por más que están escritas en la ley, no las cumplen, ¿no? Uno de los temas que no se cumplen y que gracias al almirante Cueto, congresista, está, digamos, haciendo una ley sobre la ley, es, por ejemplo, la famosa amnistía, entre comillas, pero no es otra cosa que el empadronamiento de armas legales, o sea, adquiridas lícitamente, pero que por alguna razón no tienen licencia. Por ejemplo, las típicas armas que me heredó mi abuelo no es un arma de la delincuencia ni de nada, y muchas armas están sin documentación, pero son realmente armas lícitas, no de delincuentes, no robadas, ni nada por el estilo. Y eso estaba contemplado en la ley. Y dijeron, señores, tienen que sacar un periodo de 180 días para legalizarlo. Y los gobiernos se hicieron caso omiso y no lo hicieron. Por ejemplo, esa es una de las cosas que está pendiente. Y otro de los temas muy importantes son 2 jalones de oreja a la ley, mejor dicho, al cumplimiento, al fiel cumplimiento de la ley. El otro jalón de orejas es que de pronto se ponen los requisitos y la institución que regula el uso y porte de armas de fuego, que es SUCAMEC, dijo, no, bueno, yo te voy a pedir que me cuentes en una cartita por qué tienes una arma, y si a mí me da la gana pues de aprobarte un arma, bueno, pues te la apruebo, si no. Es como que si yo fuera a sacar mi DNI y te pregunten, ya, estos son tus requisitos, pero, a ver, cuéntame por qué quieres sacar DNI. Es medio absurdo, porque para eso existe la ley. Y si tú cumples los requisitos, tú tienes el derecho de sacar un arma. No puede haber una discrecionalidad a la persona que está detrás del escritorio funcionario y actúo como me despierto, ¿no? Esos son los 2 jalones de oreja que yo quería dar, porque yo considero a la ley 30299 un hijo, ¿no es cierto?, de APPLAF, un hijo mío, por tanto, un hijo de Thomas, un hijo de Lucho, un hijo de Jorge y todos aquellos que apoyamos la ley. Y nosotros nos ceñimos a la ley. ¿Ok? Quiero dar, con estas palabras de introducción, la bienvenida al doctor John Lott, que nos presenta su tesis en el libro, ¿ya?, Más armas, menos crímenes. Algo que el título se explica solo. Y está clarísimo, ¿no? O sea, yo cuando hablo con mi familia, yo tengo 3 hijos, con mis 3 hijos les digo, hijos, si metemos en una casa a 10 personas buenas, sin armas, y a 2 delincuentes armados, ¿qué ocurre? Bueno, los asaltan o los violan o les roban, ¿no?, a los 10 desarmados. Ahora bien, en el mismo ejemplo, ¿qué pasa si de las 10 personas buenas, correctas, tienes 4, 5 correctamente, legalmente armados y entrenados? Entrenados, una capacitación que las tenemos todos los que tenemos ahora tenemos la capacidad de capacitarnos y los recursos para hacerlo. Y entran 2 ladrones, 2 delincuentes a querer violar, asesinar. ¿Va a ocurrir eso? No. Y lo más probable es que el delincuente vea, se dé cuenta y se retire. ¿No? Dice, voy a irme a otra casa donde no hayan patas armados. Pues. Ni loco, pues. Hay muchas casas donde no hay gente armada. Elijo esas de ahí. Y si nosotros nos unimos con la Policía Nacional, si realmente conversamos más hoy día con el tema de tecnología, si sacamos aplicativos de coordinación conjunta con usuarios de armas, algo que yo alguna vez lancé alguna idea, porque podemos sacar aplicativos móviles de seguimiento en coordinación con la Policía Nacional, usuarios de armas, sociedad civil, esta delincuencia, pues, o sea, la podemos derrotar sin ningún problema. Yo aplaudo y promuevo y quiero y lanzo acá el tema de decirles, oiga, tenemos que unirnos para que ninguna persona, sea policía, sea militar, sea civil, siquiera pise una carceleta cuando abate a un maldito delincuente. Eso jamás debe pasar. Puede pasar por una investigación, lo que quieran, pero es denigrar completamente la dignidad humana, el derecho a la vida en su momento más sublime, defenderte. Les pido a la Policía Nacional del Perú que nos unamos, que mantengamos reuniones coordinadas, que metamos tecnología, que saquemos algo bonito para el Perú, para ser un país ejemplo de paz y aplastar a esta delincuencia, abatirla finalmente, sacarla de acá y construir juntos. Doctor Don Lott, bienvenido.
Luego de estas palabras de Igor, quisiera hacer una pequeña introducción del doctor Lott que ustedes pueden ver en el libro Más Armas, Menos Crimen. Y Igor me hizo acordar, sobre todo para los miembros de la Policía Nacional, tenemos a disposición en la parte de afuera el libro de la ley de armas que nosotros hemos publicado. Gratuitamente lo pueden llevar también, por favor. Antes de que se retiren, pasen por la mesita donde les firmó el doctor Lott para que se lleven los libros de la ley de armas, cualquiera que ustedes gusten. Entonces, antes de la presentación del doctor Lott, vamos a tener unas palabras de Nikki. Es la señorita también experta en el tema de armas de fuego. El doctor Lott va a hacer la presentación de ella y luego en unos instantes hago yo la presentación del doctor Lott para que pueda iniciar su presentación. Doctor Lott.
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead.
Thanks. All right. Well, thank you very much. It's been wonderful being in here in Peru. I thank Thomas for making me gain more than a few pounds, I think, in the couple days I've been here with the restaurants he's been taking me to. And I welcome all the people on Zoom. I guess there's like 300 places that people are on Zoom watching this. So, look, anybody who's read my academic work knows that I think police are the single most important factor for reducing crime. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But the police themselves realize that they virtually always arrive on the crime scene after the crimes occurred. And the question becomes, what's the safest course of action for people to take when they're having to confront a criminal by themselves? And if my research convinces me of anything, that there's two groups of people who benefit the most from having the option to be able to go and protect themselves. People who are most likely victims of violent crime, and that overwhelmingly tends to be poor people who live in high crime urban areas, and people who are relatively weaker physically, women and the elderly. You're almost always talking about young male criminals doing the attacks, and when a man is attacking a woman, there's a larger strength difference that exists there than when a man is attacking another man. And the presence of a gun represents a much bigger relative change in a woman's ability to go and protect herself. Now, before I kind of get into a lot of numbers, because that's what I do. I don't do rights. I don't talk about whether people have a right to do something or not. To me, what got me into this research is basically what makes people safer. So I've been an academic most of my life. I've had positions at Stanford, University of Chicago, Yale, the Wharton Business School, and other places. I was just recently working in the U.S. Department of Justice as Senior Advisor for Research and Statistics, and before that, I was Chief Economist for the United States Sentencing Commission, which handles the prison system in the United States. But before I get into that, I wanted to go and spend a few minutes about people's perceptions about guns, because a lot of people's perceptions about guns comes from the media. And so I wanted to just show you, assuming this works.
Hollywood hates guns. Well, they like them and shoot them up movies. But as soon as it comes to a good civilian using a gun for self-defense, Hollywood turns anti-gun.
She shot herself.
Why the gun?
Hollywood constantly portrays people who hate guns.
I'm not a huge fan of weapons. Now do you see why I don't like them? You don't like guns either. I'm not a big fan of guns. I don't like it.
Why'd I leave the FBI? Guns, man.
It's almost as
No surprise. Hollywood's cops are wrong, and real life cops are right. Police are informed by what they see on the street every day. They know how important having a gun is for their own safety, and they know that private citizens can help. We've seen how good Samaritans. We've seen them go to the aid of others because they were good Americans with concealed weapons permits. Many Hollywood crime show writers clearly know nothing about guns and crime. The myths they push on people are endless. Stop. Since 1934, there are only 2 known uses ever of a machine gun being used in a murder. Yet Hollywood shows criminals using machine guns to outgun cops all the time.
if they're trying to condition people to hate guns. In Hollywood, even Navy SEALs warn against owning guns.
You need a gun to protect the kids when you're not around.
You'd be dangerous to yourself and to the kids.
The wise law enforcement experts constantly urge people not to use
But
them.
in my experience, the problem with carrying a gun is that eventually it will go off.
But Hollywood gets this backwards. In real life, police strongly support civilians owning guns and carrying them for self-defense. A recent survey by the National Association of Chiefs of Police. In real life, citizen volunteers and neighborhood watch programs save lives. A 2008 U.S. Justice Department analysis found that crime fell 16% in areas that started a neighborhood watch program compared to those that did not. Some of Hollywood's bias is comical. In this show, a woman asks a federal agent if he's worried about not having his gun in a gun-free zone when he's facing professional killers.
You sure about this no guns thing?
Bad guys won't have them either.
Bad guys won't have them either? Seriously? Has a bad guy ever seen a no guns allowed sign and turned around? In the show, the killers obey the signs and leave their guns behind. But in real life, gun-free zones only encourage criminals. They serve as a magnet for criminals. Virtually all the mass public shootings in the United States since 1950 have occurred in places where general citizens are banned from having guns. The Virginia Beach shooting this year was another example of this. A woman who worked at the municipal office building talked with her husband the night before the attack about bringing her permanent concealed handgun to work for self-defense. But she decided not to because of a city rule against carrying guns. She and 11 others were killed the next day by a disgruntled coworker. In another recent case, a doctor carried a gun anyway, despite his hospital's no-gun policy. And he stopped a mass public shooting. As the district attorney put it, if the doctor did not have a firearm, he'd be dead today. And I believe that other people in that facility would also be dead. That real-life situation would make a gripping TV story, but don't expect to see it. Hollywood bias is everywhere, and it endangers lives by misleading people on guns. Many Hollywood crime show writers clearly know nothing about guns and crime.
Okay,
The myths they push on
we
people
could
are
go and
endless.
talk about
else do we know about
the
these
news
guns?
media also, but I think
This
they
is the
give
machine
you
gun that
a
Davis
rough
was firing
idea
at us, so-called
of the
cop
issue.
killer.
Stop.
What I want to
Since
try to
19
do a little bit I mean, I could go through discussions about the United States, but you've recently had an experiment with another country in South America here, in Brazil. In January 2019, Bolsonaro became president of Brazil, and he started liberalizing the regulations that they have there for people being able to go and own guns. Prior to January 2019, there were about 330,000 license holders in Brazil. 330,000 license holders in Brazil. But you basically had to be in the military or a police officer to be able to have it. Very few others were allowed to have it. And when Bolsonaro changed the rules there were predictions from around the world that there were going to be disasters that were going to occur. So I'll just read you some. This is from the editorial board for Bloomberg News. Here's a simple fact affirmed by worldwide research for Bolsonaro to consider. More guns mean more deaths by gun, whether by homicide, accident, or suicide. A study in Brazil's state of São Paulo, for instance, found that a 1% increase in the number of guns in circulation resulted in a 2% increase in the homicide rate. The next quote here is from the U.S. National Public Radio. Newly elected President Bolsonaro is supremely confident he can reduce violent crime, a core pillar of his election campaign. But his proposal to dismantle national gun laws is precisely the wrong way to go about doing this. Or here's The Economist, kind of a worldwide magazine. That does not mean that gun control laws was pointless. Without it, Brazil's murder rate would have risen much more rapidly than it did. According to a study by the Institute for Applied Economic Research, a government think tank. Now, I just point out, these are in 2019. Okay, here's some as late as July 2020. Firearm exports from Austria to Brazil have surged more than 377% in the first half of this year, as gun ownership increases under South America's country's right-wing president, Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro's highly controversial relaxation of gun laws, a key pledge in his 2018 campaign, is fueling fears among experts and campaigners that such moves will add to an already shocking levels of violence. And then I could go on. The New York Times is just another example. And here's one more I'll do. But critics of the president's approach have warned that more guns are not the answer to reducing violent crime in a country where a record high 63,880 homicides took place in 2017, the most recent year for which data is available. I could give you dozens more articles from around the world predicting disaster when he loosened up the gun laws that were there. So much for these experts in the media and in many academia. Just take one of the quotes that were there before, saying a 1% increase in the number of guns in circulation resulted in a 2% increase in homicide rates. When Bolsonaro took office, as I say, there were 330,000 licensed firearm owners. Earlier this year, in January, there was almost 1.7 million. That's over a 400% increase. So if it's a 1% increase in guns results in a 2% increase in homicides, you're going to have almost over an 800% increase that's there. Obviously, that didn't happen. In fact, rather than all these experts predicting a huge increase in homicides, it fell by 34%, going from 27.8 in 2018 to 18.5 homicides per 100,000 people. you know, there have been explanations now for why their predictions didn't turn out the way that they were saying it would be. Some have said, pointed to the fact that some Brazilian states instituted a comprehensive program of police reforms, including better data collection, crime mapping, police training, coordination of military and civil forces. As I said before, I have no doubt that having more police will reduce crime. But for changes in 4 states, you should expect then that there was only a drop in some of the 25 states in Mexico, or in Brazil. And also, I'll just point out that the detractors' predictions were made from December 2018 through July 2020. So they already knew these other changes were going on at that time, and were still predicting disaster. If you look at the changes across the 25 states in Brazil, as well as the capital district, what you find is that it's not just a couple places where it fell. You have homicide rates falling across the board in all but one of these 26 areas that are there. So to go and say that there's 4 states that changed their policies isn't going to explain the drop that you have there. And you can see the drop that's occurred over time. Now, the bottom line is simply all these people were predicting disasters. That's not what happened. The opposite happened. And a 34% drop in homicides is a huge change in just a few years. Now, Police One is the largest organization of police officers in the United States. There are about 450,000 members. To give you an idea, there's about 600,000 police. So the vast majority of police in the United States belong to this. And this survey of their members asked them on a 1 to 5 scale, 1 being low, 5 being high, how important do you think it is that legally armed citizens are to reducing the overall crime rate? So 55% said it's extremely important in reducing overall crime. Another 22% said it was very important in reducing crime. So overwhelmingly, police think that law-abiding citizens having guns is either extremely or very important in terms of reducing violent crime. So one of the things that often gets into discussions about gun control are mass public shootings. And so they asked their members, what do you think can be done in order to try to stop mass public shootings? And one of the options that they gave them was to essentially get rid of gun-free zones. If you have a concealed carry permit in the United States, you can carry your gun almost any place. You know, maybe 97, 98% of the places you can carry your gun. There's a small group of places, so-called gun-free zones, where people are prevented from being able to go and carry a gun for protection. The thing is, as mentioned in the video, 94% of the mass public shootings that we have in the United States, where 4 or more people are killed, take place in those tiny areas where people are banned from having guns. And so they asked the police officers, do you think getting rid of these gun-free zones, allowing legally armed citizens to be able to go and carry, would that help in stopping these mass public shootings? 86% said that it would either reduce it or eliminate it altogether to get rid of these gun-free zones. Igor, I guess, was making the point earlier that, you know, if you have a gun-free zone, you have a sign that says you're not allowed to have a gun there, who's most likely to obey that rule? It's the most law-abiding, good citizens who obey that, not the criminals. In fact, what you actually do is accomplish the opposite of what you'd like to accomplish. Because if you're a criminal, you want to go after easier targets. And if you know your victims are defenseless in certain places, where are you going to go? So one thing you can look at is the diaries or manifestos for these mass murderers. I don't know if you heard of the recent attack we had in Buffalo, New York, where a mass murderer went into a grocery store to go and kill people. In his manifesto, he spent a great deal of time explaining why he picked the target that he did. And his number one reason was to find a place where people wouldn't have concealed handguns for protection. You know, we can have police guard places, but a police officer in uniform has an incredibly difficult job. If you have an area where guns are banned and the only person with a gun is a police officer in uniform, and the attacker is thinking about going there, think of the huge advantage the attacker has. He can wait for the officer to leave and then attack, or he can go to another target, or if he is going to attack that one place, who is he going to kill first? He's going to go and kill the police officer first. Because if he knows that that police officer is the only person with a gun and he kills the police officer, he has free rein then to go after other people then. And so, you know, God thank the police officers that try to guard these types of places, but they have an incredibly difficult job. If you allow civilians to have concealed handguns, you make the job of the officer much safer. And the reason why you do is because the killer then knows that if he starts to go after the police officer who he knows has a gun, he has to worry that somebody behind him or to the side who he can't identify beforehand might have a gun. And when he goes after the officer, he reveals his position, and he has to worry that somebody behind him may be able to go and stop him at that point. Okay, I have another video here on mass public shootings around the world, and then I'll go and speak more afterwards. This is another short video.
That's often given as a reason for more.
You've probably heard that America has the most mass shootings in the world.
That's often given as a reason for more gun
Economist John Lott looked into that
Economist
claim,
John
and
Lott
he says
looked into
it's
that
a
claim,
myth.
and he
Based
says
on
it's
one
a myth
focus
based on
study.
one.
The United States has the most mass shootings. The United States has the most mass shootings.
Public mass shootings. You don't see mass shootings.
You don't see kind of scale with this kind of scale in any other advanced nation on earth.
Where'd that claim come from? Obama and everyone else base it on.
A study done by University of Alabama professor Adam Lankford.
University of Alabama professor Adam Lankford.
This is Adam Lankford.
I studied 171 countries for more than 40 years, 1966 to 2012. And essentially the answer was, not surprisingly, the United States has by far the most public mass shooters.
This claim received coverage. This is Adam Lankford of news story.
I studied 171 countries for more than 40 years, 1966 to 2012. And essentially the answer was, not surprisingly, the United States has by far the most public mass shooters.
His claim received coverage in hundreds of news stories, but all these people were misled by Lankford. Lankford's study claimed that since 1966, there were 90 mass public shooters in the United States, more than any other country. Lankford counted 202 shooters in the rest of the world. Lankford claimed complete data were available for 171 countries. But how did Lankford find every shooting in all these countries, most of which don't speak English? And how did he find all the cases in the years before the internet? Few governments collect this data. Finding complete data for mass public shootings in just one developing country, say India in the 1970s, would be an incredible feat. Many of these shootings would have been reported only in local outlets, in the local language.
That shooting at the Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut.
On the other hand, United States mass public shootings are well documented and hard to miss. If Langford undercounted foreign cases because he missed finding old newspapers or had trouble with language barriers, his paper's entire conclusion that the United States had the most mass public shootings would fall apart. Many journalists and researchers asked Langford for his data. Not only did he refuse to share a list of his cases, or even the number of shootings he found in each country, which are nowhere in his paper, he even refused to share an explanation for how he found those cases. That's academic malpractice. Asked if he used foreign languages to search for these shootings, Langford stated, "My data were not limited to English language searches." Asked what languages he used, Langford refused to provide that information. "This is all the assistance I can provide at this time," Langford said. Look, I've researched crime for decades, and I've published dozens of peer-reviewed academic articles on the subject. Langford won't even respond to my emails with simple questions. Now, maybe he doesn't want to talk to me because I'm well known for my research, More Guns, Less Crime. But Langford has refused to share his list of shooters and methods, even with strong gun control advocates. This all seemed very suspicious to me. So the think tank that I run, the Crime Prevention Research Center, researched it. Unlike Langford, we took a lot of time to find all the foreign cases we could. We even got translators to identify cases. Using the same definition of mass public shooters Langford used, 4 more people killed in a public place, not part of some other type of crime, we found that he grossly undercounted foreign attacks. We counted well over 3,000 shooters, at least 15 times more shooters as Langford claimed.
31% of total shooters, despite the fact that we only have 5% of the world's population.
Of the 86 countries where we have identified any mass public shootings occurring, the United States ranks 62nd. Norway, Finland, Switzerland, and Russia are European countries with significantly higher rates of murders from mass public shootings.
The explanation is firearm ownership rate.
When Langford's data are fixed, there is no relationship between gun ownership rates and mass public shooters. There's a lesson here. Langford's critical but simple error could have been picked up if journalists had only demanded his data and methods before publicizing his study. Journalists should learn to be skeptical. In the meantime, we should all be skeptical of news coverage of studies like this.
I have a simple question for you. We've had places around the world that have banned.
You've probably heard.
In the United States, you've had places like Chicago and Washington, D.C. We've had whole nations that have either banned all guns or all handguns. If guns in private hands are net bad, you would think it would be easy to find places that ban guns that saw murder rates go down. I can't find a place. Every single place in the world that's banned either all guns or all handguns has seen murder rates go up. So I'll just show you a little bit of data here. So this is for Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C.'s handgun ban went into effect in February 1977. Its murder rate had been falling relative to the other 50 large cities in the country, and then went up and basically stayed up about 40, 60, 80% higher after the ban. Okay, so here's Chicago. This is the other place. Chicago's handgun ban went into effect in October 1982. This is Chicago's murder rate relative to the other 9 largest cities for the top 10. Chicago's murder rate was falling consistently right up until the ban went into effect, and then it was rising afterwards. Now, a lot of gun control advocates will say, well, looking at Chicago and Washington, D.C. aren't really fair experiments. Because unless you ban guns every place in a country, criminals can go and get guns from neighboring states. The problem is they could get guns from those places to begin with. This might explain why it didn't go down as they were predicting, but it doesn't explain why the murder rates would go up afterwards. Also, as I'll show you, there are plenty of places around the world where entire nations have banned guns. And every time murder rates go up there too. And finally, I just say, look, if it was so obvious that a gun ban was going to result in an increase in murder rates, it would have been nice if they had shared that guess with us before they instituted the ban. Now I'm going to just show you some data for island nations. And the reason for looking at island nations is because I mean, I could show it for others too, but it's kind of the ideal experiment. There's no neighbors that they can go and blame for being the source of the guns, just like they were saying, well, you know, neighboring states, people could go and get guns. So here's Ireland. This is the Republic of Ireland. Their gun ban went into effect in 1972. Prior to the ban, their murder rates bouncing up and down. But there's a real obvious change that occurred right when the ban went into effect. Their murder rates are much higher. Now, there's a lot of drug gang fighting that's going on over here, and there's some drug gang fighting that's going over here. But even if you remove the drug gang fights, it's still obviously much higher murder rate after the ban than beforehand. And I'll point out also that it's pretty hard to get guns away from drug gangs, just like it's pretty hard to stop the drug gangs from getting the illegal drugs that they have. And the two coincide with each other, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Here's Jamaica. Jamaica's gun ban went into effect in the beginning of 1975. Their murder rate up until then was actually very similar to the murder rate in the United States. After their ban went into effect, there was a huge increase in murder rates. There was some political violence that occurred here, and there's a lot of very heavy drug gang violence that occurred in these years. Now here's the United Kingdom, England and Wales. Their handgun ban went into effect in January 1997. You can see within the next 8 years, their homicide rate went up by 50%. And only after 8 years did it start to come back down. And by the time you get out to about 16, 17 years, it was about back down to where it was prior to the ban going into effect. There's actually a very simple explanation for why it peaked and went back down, why it went down after that. Okay. And that's because they had a huge increase in the number of police. Right at that time, in those 2 years leading up to where it peaked, they had a 14% increase in the number of police in 2 years. Over 3 years, they had an 18% increase in the number of police. People were very upset about the increased crime, and so they hired a lot more police. And as they hired a lot more police, they were able to go and bring down the murder rate right at that time, right after the big increases started to come back down. But even with that huge increase in police, they were only able to bring it back down about to where it was prior to the ban going into effect. All right. Now, I don't find cross-sectional data very useful. All the time, people make comparisons. They'll say, you know, the United Kingdom has a lower homicide rate than the United States, and it has strict gun control laws, and few people own guns. So it must be the fact that they have a lower homicide rate. Newspapers, all the time, they'll make comparisons, who has guns and who has the murder rates. There are very few academics who make what we'd call purely cross-sectional, looking across different places in one point in time. And the reason for that is that there's so many different reasons that homicide murder rates vary across places. What most academics do is to look over time in many different places to see how they change before and after you've had some change in the rules that are there. But I'm going to just show you cross-sectional data here because that's what we see all the time in many popular discussions in newspapers and what have you. All right, so this is homicide rates across all countries. The average homicide rate is here. The median value, which is Lebanon, is right here, and then the US is in red over here, okay? And there's maybe one comment I should make here, and that is most lay people don't understand the difference between murder and homicide. Most lay people think that murders and homicides are the same, and they're not. Homicides are murders plus justifiable homicides. And it's never really been obvious to me why those two are lumped together in there, because I think they're very different in terms of whether it's good or bad. If somebody's murdered in the course of a robbery, that's very different to me than if a woman shoots a rapist that tries to break into her house in the middle of the night. Now, one problem here is that very few countries report murder rate data. The vast majority of countries only report homicide data. And for the United States, that's a bit of a problem because about 20% of our homicides are justifiable homicides, which is much higher than it is for most countries. So if you were to actually have this in terms of murders, the United States would probably be down over here someplace rather than where it is right there. Now I'm going to show you the graph for firearm homicides. And here, things look very different. The average is up here. The United States is over here. And you have the median, which means half are below and half are above, is way down here. Now, if you look at these graphs, you may notice something's a little strange. These lines are a lot thinner. It's a lot harder to see the names there. Everything's all scrunched up. They're much bigger here. Well, there's a simple reason for that, and that is about half the countries in the world don't report firearm homicide data. Which countries do you think don't report firearm homicide data? It's the countries with the highest homicide rates. So, you know, if I just said, okay, the top half of these countries aren't going to report the firearm homicide data, it's going to make the United States look a lot worse, right? Because the ones that have high homicide data also have high firearm homicide rates, presumably. Now, this is also assuming that all the data is accurate for these countries. A lot of countries, the firearm homicide data and the homicide data is very suspect. I'll give you one example. Venezuela, the official homicide data for Venezuela a few years ago would have been like 60 homicides per 100,000 people. There's some NGOs, non-governmental organizations, have gone through and simply counted news stories in newspapers to try to figure out what the homicide rate is, and they were estimating it was more than 100 per 100,000 people. But even those news stories probably greatly underestimate the total. First of all, not every murder gets a news story, okay? And secondly, the Venezuelan government would put pressure on people not to talk to the media about their relative being killed, because if somebody talked to the media, then the bodies would not be released to the people that were there. And so there's lots of reasons for believing it was underestimated. Here's the homicide rate data for developed countries. This is all the developed countries. Often, a lot of the news articles that you'll see will ignore many of the countries with the very highest homicide rates, like Brazil and Mexico and Russia, Chile is slightly higher than the United States. So what I want to try to do, this is the type of graph you often see in news media. This is from Vox. And they'll have guns per 100 people on one axis, and they'll have gun-related deaths per 100,000 people on the other axis. And they'll show what appears to be a positive relationship. More guns presumably mean more homicides. First of all, I wouldn't measure it this way. To me, there's a big difference. If I could have two countries where one country I have 100 guns per 100 people, but everybody has one gun each, or I have 100 guns per 100 people and 1% of the people have 100 guns and the other 99 people have 0 guns. Those two countries are going to be very different in terms of whether people can use guns defensively or not, okay? So if I were to do this, I would have guns, the percent of the population with guns. This data, though, is from something called the Small Arms Survey, which George Soros funds. But I'm going to use this data in my discussion just because so many other people use it. So let's just look at this a little bit. Here, I'm just redoing the graph. This is for homicides and firearms per 100 people. And this is not for all the developed countries, but you see the United States is way out there and you get a positive relationship. It looks like more guns are related to more homicides, a positive line there. What happens if we remove just the United States from this? What you're going to see is that that by itself causes you to have a little bit of a negative relationship there. And if you include the United States and these other developed countries here, again, you're going to find that more guns actually are associated with fewer homicides. And this is looking at it for all the countries in the world, and this is looking at firearm homicide rates rather than total homicide rates. I made a graph for just Latin American countries. This is data from 2019 or latest year that it's available. And this is the homicide rate here. And this is the percentage of the adult population with gun licenses. And you can see here that you actually tend to have lower homicide rates when you have a higher percentage of the population with licenses to own guns. So I kind of already talked about this. The issue is who obeys these gun-free zones. And it's relevant for the discussions that I was showing you before about gun bans. The issue is if I pass a law tomorrow that bans guns, who are the people that are most likely to obey that ban and turn in their guns? What I find is it's the most law-abiding citizens. And if you have it, make it so that the most law-abiding citizens, not the criminals, are the ones who obey the ban and turn in their guns, then you actually make it easier for the criminals to go and commit crimes. And that's the reason why when I showed you the data where you have a ban and you see increases all the time, that you see these increases in murder rates and homicide rates that occur. One of the things that you see, I'm sure people in law enforcement understand this, and that is this notion of what's called marginal deterrence. So if I have a penalty of, let's say, 2 years for you taking a gun into a gun-free zone, for a law-abiding citizen, that's a big penalty, right? I mean, you take me or you and you become a felon and you're in jail for 2 years, your life will be completely changed. But let's say you're someone who's going to go and kill lots of people in a place. And I say, okay, this is a gun-free zone, 2 years in prison if you break it and take the gun in there. But you're already planning on killing 8, 10, 12 people. You're already going to be facing, let's say, 8 life sentences. Is 2 more years going to be the penalty that causes that person not to commit the crime when they're already going to be facing 8 or 10 or 12 life sentences? And the answer is no. It makes no deterrence for somebody who's already planning on committing a crime and already going to be facing a lot of years in prison. Okay, well, I just want to kind of summarize here, and then I'll introduce the next speaker. And then we'll take questions afterwards. At least I understand that's the way people want to do it. Look, if my research convinces me of anything, it's the most vulnerable people in our societies who benefit the most from having the option to be able to go and protect themselves. When you're having to confront a criminal by yourself, by far the safest course of action for somebody to take is to have a gun. And it's particularly true for people who are relatively weaker physically, and it's particularly true for those who are the most likely victims of violent crime. It would be great if the police could be there all the time. My understanding is, so in the United States, we have about 332 million people with about 600,000 police. And at any point in time, you have no more than about 250,000 police on duty at maximum at any point in time. It's simply impossible for the police to be there to go and protect everybody that's there. In Peru, you have about 30 million people, and my understanding is you have about 120,000 police. So you have more police per capita than we have in the United States. But it's still a huge job to go and protect all 30 million people that are out there all the time. You simply can't be there all the time. And the question becomes, what should people do when they're having to confront a criminal by themselves? And the people who are the most vulnerable ones are the ones that I would argue are the ones who benefit the most from having the option to protect themselves. So I guess while they're changing the PowerPoint presentations, I'll make an introduction for, she's the executive director for our organization, the Crime Prevention Research Center. Nikki is the executive director for the Crime Prevention Research Center. She's worked in government. She worked for the state legislature in Tennessee. She also worked as an assistant for a congressman in Washington, D.C., where she served as the director for the Second Amendment Caucus, which is the group of congressmen who feel people's ability to defend themselves is important. And she's going to tell her story and kind of relate to you at a more personal level some of the points that I've been making.
Hello there. My name is Nikki Gosser, and I apologize. I do not speak Spanish. I did take Spanish in high school, but I was not a very good student when I was young, and I didn't pay enough attention like I should have. And now as a grown adult, I wish I had paid attention. Thank you for putting up with me right now. I am a victim of a violent crime in the United States of America, but I do not hate guns. Guns can and do save innocent lives. I'm here to share my story of what can happen when you are prevented from being able to protect yourself with a gun. This is a picture of myself and my deceased husband, Benjamin. We were married for 1 year, 4 months, and 2 days. Newly married and very happy. Ben and I had regular corporate jobs during the day, but we owned a mobile karaoke business. We lived in Nashville, Tennessee, and that is known as Music City, famous for country music in the United States. And karaoke is a huge part of tourism in that area. So we had this mobile karaoke business that we would run in the evenings at different places, different venues. And we really enjoyed it, and it was a lot of fun, and it became very popular. That's us. We lived in a very rural area, just outside of the city of Nashville. When we were running these karaoke shows, we would have regular customers that would come in to sing songs and have fun and have drinks and, you know, enjoy the evening. There was one particular karaoke customer. He would come in to sing, and he had a very unhealthy, strange interest in me. And it got to the point where I had to delete him and block him from my social media that I used to communicate with customers and keep our customer base for our business. My husband had to ask him to please, you know, leave me alone because the guy, I had to delete him and block him from my social media that I used to communicate with customers and keep our customer base for our business. My husband had to ask him to please, you know, leave me alone because the guy was creepy. He was freaking me out, made me very uncomfortable. So let me explain what happened. This was 13 years ago. This man came to one of our karaoke shows, and I realized at that point that he was stalking me, and I asked management to please remove him from the venue. Let them know, please help me. This man is stalking me. When management confronted him and asked him to leave, he pulled a .45 caliber handgun from a shoulder holster under his jacket that was concealed, and he shot my husband right in front of myself and everyone in the middle of that busy restaurant where we were running our karaoke show. He then stood over my husband. Ben fell to the ground, and he stood over Ben and continued to fire 6 more rounds into him. I had my handgun carry permit at the time. I carried a gun every single day to protect myself. I've had the state certified training, passed the background check, had my fingerprints taken. I was actually a firearms range volunteer at the time. I helped train people on firearm safety, how to shoot, and I'll never know if I could have prevented that from happening because that restaurant we were in was a gun-free zone. So I followed the law as a law-abiding citizen and left my legal handgun locked inside of my vehicle in the parking lot. The man who was stalking me did not have a handgun carry permit, brought a gun inside of a gun-free zone illegally, and murdered my husband. That situation and that horrific scene is something that will be forever etched in my mind. I will never, ever forget what I saw. The smell of, some people don't know what this smells like, but it's the mixture of gunpowder and blood at the same time, and hearing the screams and realizing that I heard screaming and screaming, of course, from other people, but I realized that I was screaming. The screams I was hearing that were so loud were actually coming from me. That man was eventually tried in a court of law and sentenced to only 23 years in prison. And in the United States, you're allowed to earn early release good behavior credits. So this man doesn't even have to serve the full sentence. He gets released early. I have recently learned that he is still stalking me. He's just doing it from prison now. These are twisted, demented love letters that this sick, disgusting man has sent me from prison. This man is set to be released in just 6 more years. This is terrifying for me. Anyone with a brain that functions should understand why I want to be able to carry my legal handgun wherever I go. Because when he's released, I have a real problem on my hands. This man has already proven how dangerous he is, how deadly he is, and he's still obsessed with me. And I don't know why. I have no idea. I'm sure you as law enforcement have dealt with situations where there are men that just will not take no for an answer. And women are terrified for their safety. It's infuriating. And I am here to try and explain, why it's so important that people be able to protect themselves and their loved ones. That's my handgun that was locked in my vehicle that night. That handgun is a Smith & Wesson, that's a Smith & Wesson 38 caliber airweight revolver. 5 shots, 5 reliable shots. Benjamin bought me that handgun for my birthday. That is the gun that should have helped save his life, but I was denied a chance. I was stalked and defenseless. I refuse to be defenseless again. This is me shooting my 12-gauge shotgun. I have a lot of guns. I enjoy shooting. This is a competition shotgun. It's a Mossberg 940 JM Pro, and these are some of my friends, and we all have guns. That one I'm carrying is a Henry Golden Boy lever action 22 long rifle. I ended up writing a book about my situation to try and educate people about the dangers of gun-free zones, because when you make good law-abiding people helpless, you actually make things easier for those with evil intent, for criminals. They know that they can go and harm many people very easily. Women and the elderly are at a huge disadvantage physically. It's just true. I mean, most of the attackers are usually younger men, and let's face it, younger men in general, are going to be a lot stronger than me. One man will be much stronger than me. Multiple men, I know I don't have a chance. Police, I think, are very, very important. I am a huge supporter of police, but even police know they cannot be anywhere and everywhere at any time. In the United States, most of the rank and file police officers out in the streets every single day, they support gun rights for law-abiding citizens. They firmly support gun rights for law-abiding people. In general, once you start getting up to the higher ranking officials in law enforcement, then you start seeing where they may be politically influenced. And some of them are like, oh, no, we don't want, people having guns. We want to support more gun-free zones. But in general, it's most of the men and women officers who are out there in the streets, seeing the crimes all the time. They understand the value of good people being able to protect themselves and their loved ones. Guns are a great equalizer, when dealing with disparity of force, that difference in strength between the weaker person and the stronger person. Guns can prevent if a gun is in the hands of a good person. And let's face it, police virtually always arrive at the crime scene after the crime has already been committed. And it's not the police fault. There's just not enough police. They can't be everywhere. But my book is called Stalked and Defenseless. This is my friend Amanda. She was also in a gun-free zone at a college, and she had a handgun carry permit. This was in Reno, Nevada, but her campus was a gun-free zone. So she followed that rule and left her gun at home. A serial rapist found her in the student parking garage at night after her class ended. She's walking to her car, and this man brutally raped her in that student parking garage. And he did some unspeakable things, but he went on to rape more women, and he actually murdered another woman. And Amanda has spoken out about how she believes gun-free zones endangered her. It made it easy for that man to do that to her. And this is my friend Susanna Hupp. She's from Texas, and she was this was back in 1991. She was a brand new doctor, a chiropractor, back doctor. She was going to celebrate her new office opening with her parents, and they went to a cafeteria to have lunch. A madman drove his truck through the window of the restaurant. Well, at the time, everyone in the restaurant's thinking, this is a horrible accident, a medical emergency. You know, the poor guy had a heart attack or something. So people are natural, good people. They go to check on him. And he gets out of the truck with 2 handguns, and he just starts to kill people. He's just killing people. And Susanna, she and her family threw a wooden table up, and they were hiding behind it. Susanna had a gun, but because of Texas at the time, she was too afraid to carry it with her because of the Texas law at that time. So she left her gun in the car. So her father said, I've got to stop this guy. He's going to murder everybody in here. So her dad went to try and run after the guy and tackle him. Well, the murderer is the only one with the gun. He was in complete control. He just shot Susanna's dad. And of course, he fell to the ground. And Susanna says, I know this sounds horrible, but I basically had to write my own father off and accept the fact that he was mortally wounded. He was going to die. There was another man that had basically run and thrown his own body through the window and broke a big hole in the window behind them. Susanna grabbed her mother by the shirt collar and said, Mom, we have got to run out that window. We've got to run fast now. And Susanna's feet grew wings. She got out the window, and she realized that her mother had not followed her. Her parents had been married a very long time, and her mother went to cradle and hold her dying husband. That madman walked right up to her mother, held the gun to her head, and executed her in front of Susanna. And Susanna tells this story to try and help educate people about the dangers of gun-free zones. And Susanna went on to become a state representative in the Texas legislature. But this is a quote that I love from Susanna. She's a very nice lady. How a politician stands on the Second Amendment, or gun rights, tells you how he or she views you as an individual, as a trustworthy and productive citizen, or as a part of an unruly crowd that needs to be lorded over, controlled, supervised, and taken care of. 94% of mass public shootings in the United States of America occur in gun-free zones. Why? Where these crimes do occur, they are almost always in areas where good, law-abiding people are not allowed to carry guns for self-defense in public. These are mostly movie theaters, shopping malls, college campuses, schools. When the bad guy is the only one with a gun, he has total control over everyone. I've gone over most of these, but one thing I do want to say, in the United States, The media makes these evil people famous. The media does huge damage to society by giving these murderers that attention that they seek. You know, it encourages others who are evil to do the same over and over and over again. And the media fails to tell the public the truth. They never tell the public that the shooting occurred where guns are banned. The leftist mainstream media in North America hates guns and lawful gun ownership. This is what I believe should be celebrated in the media. This young man, Elijah Dicken, he's 22 years old. He is a hero. He stopped a mass public shooter at an Indiana mall in the U.S. He carried his legal gun, despite the mall being a gun-free zone, and he killed that shooter. He saved many innocent lives. This is a very brave young man. People use guns defensively in the United States about 2 million times a year. And I believe that people should have the basic human right of self-defense. And I believe that gun rights are also women's rights. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
So I guess we'll take questions. Go ahead.
¿Tú le traduces? Ok. Señor Lott, ante todo, muchas gracias por su presentación esta noche, Aniki. Uno de los argumentos que se utiliza en la región y muy usado en el Perú es que los usuarios legales de armas somos los responsables de los crímenes cometidos con armas o los que abastecemos a los delincuentes con nuestras armas legales. Yo quisiera saber si usted tiene en sus estadísticas qué cantidad de crímenes se producen con armas de origen legal. Y mi segunda pregunta, porque aquí los delincuentes utilizan armas de asalto, incluso granadas y muchas pistolas. Hay terrorismo y narcotráfico que son muy violentos. Y los usuarios de caza, como soy yo, de armas de uso deportivo, el Perú tiene solo 4 medallas olímpicas, 3 de las cuales son de tiro. Entonces, cuando hay restricción por el tema de armas, a los usuarios legales y sobre todo a los cazadores y deportistas, nos meten en la misma bolsa de los delitos o los crímenes con armas. Yo quería saber si tú también en tus estadísticas has visto qué porcentaje de crímenes se producen con armas de caza.
Okay, well, okay, there are a couple questions there. What I would point out first is that the numbers I was showing you before about what happens to crime rates after guns are banned, that you actually see murder rates going up. Criminals are obviously still obtaining guns, even when you've taken guns away from legal citizens that are there. The major source of criminal guns in the United States are drug dealers. Drug dealers have guns because they have extremely valuable property that they need to protect. It's not like a drug gang can go to the police and say, this other gang stole our drugs. Can you help us get them back? The drug gangs have to essentially set up their own little militaries in order to go and protect that very valuable property. And so I was mentioning the spikes in murders for Jamaica or for Ireland when they would have drug gang wars break out in those countries. Drug gangs basically find it as easy to bring in the illegal guns as it is for them to go and bring in illegal drugs. If you think you can go and stop drug gangs from getting illegal drugs, you know, good luck on that. but you're not going to be any more successful in stopping them from getting the guns than you were stopping them from having the illegal drugs. As far as rifles being used, hunting weapons that you're talking about in the United States, I could tell you about 2% of murders involve any type of rifle. And, so that's a very tiny percentage of murders. If you look at all firearm murders, you're talking about maybe 3.5% of firearm murders involve any type of rifle. So your last question, for hunting type weapons, it's very rare that you see those types of weapons being used. It's just not practical for most criminals to be using rifles in the commission of crimes. I don't know for Bolivia, Peru, I don't know the breakdown in terms of the types of weapons that are being used, but I imagine it's fairly similar.
Muy buenas noches, Dr. Lott. Quería saber si en su experiencia en diversos países o en Estados Unidos existe alguna iniciativa conjunta con las fuerzas del orden, con la policía de su país, entre la sociedad civil o entre las instituciones que representan pro armas, pro defensa, pro legítima defensa y la Policía Nacional que usted pueda sugerir para replicar acá en nuestro país.
There's nothing formal. I would just say the strongest supporters of private ownership of guns in the United States probably are the police, because the police see themselves how valuable it is for them to have guns. They know, and likewise, among the strongest supporters of police are private gun owners when you look at surveys. Look at support for defunding police, which has become kind of an issue in the United States. Gun owners are in favor of strong increases in funding for police. One of the major reasons why people own guns in the United States, the major reason is concern about crime and protecting themselves. And I think most gun owners understand that how important police are in doing that, but they realize that police, what you want to do to reduce crime is to make it risky for criminals to commit crime. And you can make it risky with higher arrest rates, higher conviction rates, longer prison sentences. But you can also make it risky for criminals to commit crime by an individual being able to go and protect themselves. And so I think most law enforcement in the United States and gun owners who are owning guns for self-protection realize that they're in the same fight that's there. Can we make it difficult and risky for criminals to go and commit crime? So you have a lot of police officers who are members of private gun associations, but there's no really formal type of relationship that goes on there that I know of.
Buenas noches, Profesor Lott.
Thank you.
Goser. Quería hacer una preguntita. En Estados Unidos, ¿cuántos estados, o mejor dicho, la Constitución permite el uso de armas en general, entiendo? Sin embargo, algunos estados establecen limitaciones para su uso. Más o menos, ¿cuáles son los lineamientos legales para esas limitaciones? Y en el caso de la señora Goser, quería decirle que aquí en el Perú también la justicia suele tener resoluciones ilógicas y quería saber si en el caso o casos como el de ella, luego de haberse sentenciado, si se presentan nuevas pruebas, es posible que estos casos sean apelados, digamos, habiendo terminado ya el proceso.
Well, there are a lot of points to this question. I'll just deal with the last one first. Once you're tried and convicted of a crime, you can't be tried again. So even if new evidence comes up that may make it clear that the person should have gotten additional penalties, it's too late. You have to do it to begin with. So you're asking how the laws vary, and that's changing now in the United States because of some recent decisions by our Supreme Court. One of the big things that we've had, and I think this may be somewhat relevant for Peru, there were 7 of the 50 states that were requiring that people had to provide a good reason to be able to go and carry a concealed handgun outside their home. And the Supreme Court recently said, since the Second Amendment says people have the right to keep and bear arms, where bear means to carry, that you had a fundamental right to be able to go and carry outside the home. And so they've taken away this restriction that you have to provide a good reason for being able to do that. Now, there are other rules that we have, like in the United States, you have to pass a background check to be able to go and buy a gun. But, you know, that's pretty much the main rule that we have across all the states. There is also a limit on how powerful the gun can be. It's basically a 50 caliber type gun. But anything up till that, there's no real federal restrictions that are there. Other types of rules are going to be challenged in the near future, I think, in the courts. But it's the vast majority of the country has relatively few restrictions. So in half of the states, you can carry without a permit. You don't need a permit to be able to carry. In the other 25, it's what they call now right to carry or shall issue, where once you're a certain age, you pass a criminal background check, you pay a fee. A few of them require some type of training, but it's basically, you just have to, if you think you should have a license and you're not a criminal background, then you're able to carry.
Sir, my name is Katie Baldwin. I'm a shooter here in Lima, Peru. I would like to know, in the United States, which is the percentage of women using firearms for self-defense?
Right. Okay. So there are different types of numbers that we have. Kind of the most solid data we have are concealed carry permits, because, and what you find is about a third of concealed carry permit holders now are women. And it's increased fairly dramatically in the last decade. We've seen the growth rate for concealed carry permits for women has been about twice the rate of increase for men. And you've seen polling and other things that indicate that women have begun to get a much more positive view. You know, so Nikki has this case of stalking that's occurred. Traditionally, what's happened is that they've told women when they're being stalked that, well, maybe you should think of moving, or you should think of getting another job, or you should stay indoors and what have you. But I think there are more women now who are realizing that maybe it's not best to go and change their whole lives, because these stalkers can maybe find where they're going to be going anyway. And what do you do when you're having to confront the stalker there? You can go and get a restraining order, which tells the person, you know, to stay away from the woman. But if they're going to kill the woman, for example, the additional couple-year prison term that you're going to get for, you know, stalking is trivial compared to the fact that this person's already going to be facing a very long sentence for murdering or raping the woman that's going to be there. And so I would say there's been a big change over the last decade in terms of women doing it. And there have been surveys that have accompanied that.
Gracias. Buenas noches, soy el coronel en la situación militar de retiro del Ejército, Augusto Moreno Felan, asesor del congresista José William Zapata. Desde ya los saludos para usted, el congresista, que por razones de función no ha podido venir. Yo quiero en primer lugar también felicitarlo por la exposición, todo muy instructivo, la suya y la de la señora Nikki. Y más bien quisiera que me permita, dentro de las investigaciones que usted ha realizado, he podido ver algunas estadísticas donde figura el caso de Perú, ¿no? ¿Usted qué piensa al respecto? Porque en realidad, como dice el título de su libro, yo creo que está rompiendo paradigmas, ¿no? Porque a veces pensamos que a mayor cantidad de armas que pueda tener nuestra población, nuestros ciudadanos, podría haber mayor riesgo de causar más muertes, ¿no? Pero realmente las estadísticas, el caso de Brasil que ha mostrado, creo que México también es un buen ejemplo, los efectos son totalmente diferentes, ¿no? Entonces yo quisiera concretamente ver en el caso peruano si usted tiene algún acercamiento, algunas conclusiones dentro de las estadísticas, dentro de las investigaciones que ha realizado. Gracias.
Well, let me just mention Mexico first. Up until 1972, Mexico actually tended to have relatively liberal gun control laws. In 1972, they instituted a very strict licensing program. Only less than 0.1% of the adult population in Mexico is licensed to legally own a gun now. And since 1972, there's been only one gun store in the country. It's been run by the military. It's very costly to go and buy guns. And yet, from 1972 on, the murder rate in Mexico has gone up by 2.5 times. There's been a huge increase in that period of time. There are recent years, where the murder rate in Mexico is 6 times higher than the murder rate in the United States. And drug gangs, just as they can go and get the drugs there, are able to go and bring in weapons from around the world that's there. You know, with regard to Peru, you know, you don't have a huge amount of gun ownership in the country, but one of the things that you do have is if somebody legally owns a handgun and they're licensed, then they can carry the gun with them. And that makes you unique as far as Latin American countries go. I've met senators in Mexico when I've testified there who have complained that despite lots and lots of death threats, they have a very difficult time, a basically impossible time, getting a permit to be able to go and carry a gun. So civilians in Peru are an advantage for that. If it were me, I know you have fees for the licensing and what have you. I would think of ways of trying to even reduce the fees that are there. Because again, you know, a lot of these fees may not stop you or many of the people in this room or listening from being able to get a gun. But my concern is if my research in the United States applies here, it's the poorest people who are the ones who benefit the most from having a gun for protection, because they're the ones who are most likely living in high crime areas and facing the greatest risks that are there.
Profesor Lott, es un honor poder conocerlo. Mi nombre es Víctor Díaz. Trabajo como fiscal en este país. Bien, y ha sido un placer poder haber analizado algunos de sus trabajos y poder haberlo citado incluso para una publicación realizada sobre un tema de seguridad pública.
Thank you.
Y una de las cosas que deseaba preguntarle como experto en la temática es lo siguiente. ¿Existe alguna información confiable de que las órdenes de alejamiento, las líneas de ayuda, los botones de pánico o alguna otra herramienta tecnológica haya superado la eficiencia de un arma de fuego para la protección personal? ¿Por qué pregunto esto? Y obviamente anticipo su respuesta. Porque si la respuesta es negativa, entonces no podríamos sustentar ni ética ni legalmente la prohibición de una persona para acceder a un instrumento para protegerse. Entonces, porque si no estaríamos afectando de forma fundamental su derecho a proteger su vida, su integridad, su misma libertad, como usted hace un momento expresó con la presentación de nuestra oradora. Entonces, le preguntaba todo esto porque nosotros tenemos una administración en el Estado peruano que obliga a los ciudadanos justamente a explicar esta clase de razones. Entonces, quería justamente entender si es que en algún lugar del mundo existe información empírica, existe información científica que permita justificar tal tipo de prohibiciones o tales requisitos arbitrarios, si es que no existe información confiable de por medio. Muchas gracias.
Sure. Well, the United States rules have changed a fair amount over time. The states in the United States, if you go back 20, 30, 40 years ago, most of the states used to have the type of good reason provisions that you're mentioning here. Now no states have those provisions. And we can go and look to see what happened to crime rates afterwards. What you find consistently is when a state goes from having people provide a good reason, you know, for why they should be able to have a gun for protection when they're outside their home, to no longer having to provide that good reason, we see a big increase in the number of concealed handgun permits that are there, and we see consistent drops in murder and violent crime rates. And you find it's particularly crimes against women where we see the biggest effect in terms of drops in crimes. Basically, each additional woman getting a concealed carry permit has about a 3 to 4 times larger drop in murder rates for women than you see for an additional man getting a permit for benefits for men. And that's the type of thing that we've talked about before in terms of strength differences that are there. When you're talking about restraining orders, there's some people restraining orders can make a difference, but what you find is that the most dangerous people, it doesn't stop them, because the dangerous people who represent real harm to the woman, who are going to be facing murder charges or rape charges, those people are already going to be facing severe penalties if they go and do this. And so, you know, I don't know what the penalties are for violating restraining orders in Peru, but in the United States, the penalty may be up to a year. So the thing is, if I go and murder somebody and they face 20 years in jail for doing that, will the restraining order really make that much of a difference if we're talking about, rather than 20 years in jail, 21 years now? It doesn't make much of a difference in term for. So you have two different types of criminals. You have those that may just bug a woman, and those who actually represent a real danger to them. And the problem is the restraining orders don't really protect the ones where you're talking about the person representing a real danger to the woman.
At this point, Doctor, I would like to present you with a gift from the association to you. I hope that every time you see it on your desk, you will remember that you were here in Peru giving this talk. I know that you heard saying the horse is missing.
Yeah, I know it's no horse. What do I do? I get saddle and no horse.
It's a Peruvian Paso horse, Peruvian Paso saddle. So I hope let's take a picture of that.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you very much. Thank you. I have to come back another time to get the horse, right? For the horse. Yeah, okay. Okay.
And this is yours.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Nikki, at this point, it is usual that we give you flowers, but you wouldn't take the flowers anywhere. So we thought that something that you may take with you would be better. This is for you.
Oh, thank you.
It's a alpaca poncho.
Thank you so much. Yes, beautiful.
Thank you. Gracias.
Thank you.
Ok, amigos, muchas gracias por su participación. Agradecemos al doctor Lott por haber venido, haber hecho el esfuerzo desde Brasil, de haber venido a estar con nosotros. Gracias a todos ustedes, gracias a los miembros de la Policía Nacional por haber estado también esta noche con nosotros. Gracias, embajador, por permitirnos también estar aquí con su presencia. Así que muchas gracias a todos ustedes. Buenas noches. Gracias, Mónica, también por la traducción.